In the cold, mist-shrouded forest village, life unfolded with the rigid precision of tradition, and yet beneath its orderly surface, secrets festered. Among them, the birth of a child so carefully concealed that few even suspected his existence. His mother, a young woman bound by the strict expectations of the village and fear of social condemnation, had delivered him alone in the attic of her family's cabin. No midwife dared to assist openly, for the village's moral code deemed unapproved birth shameful, sometimes dangerous, to the family's standing. Even the father, a man of influence whose name carried weight, had demanded silence, fearing scandal. Thus, from his very first breath, the child's life was one of secrecy, observed only by a mother whose love was shadowed by fear. The child grew among whispers and half-glances. He was taught, even before he could walk steadily, to hide, beneath straw, behind shutters, in the narrow spaces between beams. His senses sharpened to the rhythm of the village, the echo of footsteps on wooden planks, the creak of shutters, the hushed tones of suspicion. He learned which doors opened and closed slowly, which paths were watched at dawn, and which windows offered momentary escape. By the time he was able to toddle through the cabins, he could move unseen, blend with shadows, and anticipate the villagers' movements with startling acuity. Even small incidents left impressions upon him. One evening, a neighbor's cat had slipped into the attic where he played, and the sudden clamor had drawn the gaze of a patrolling hunter. He froze, unnoticed, and from that moment, instinct to assess every risk became second nature. Another time, his mother left a single light burning to signal she was present, and he learned that subtle cues, like smoke curling from a chimney or a shadow cast on a wall, could provide vital information without anyone speaking a word. Each lesson, though simple, accumulated into an extraordinary understanding of both forest and village, turning his infancy into a carefully choreographed dance of observation and discretion. Rumors began to circulate, as they always did in such a tightly knit place. Neighbors whispered of a mysterious presence in the forest, or of footprints too small, too precise, to belong to known children. The hunters noted disturbances in the underbrush, broken twigs, or footprints leading nowhere. None suspected the truth fully, that the very child they sought was already shaping himself into someone who could evade them, who understood fear and used it silently as armor. The village did not know that the true threat to their assumptions had been born in secrecy, nurtured by silence, and trained by observation. The earliest days of this account begin with the mist itself, an ever-present veil that drifted through the remote forest village as though conscious of its own role in narrowing the world. It clung to the wooden beams of cottages, softened the outlines of barns, soaked the moss that grew between the stones of the narrow footpaths, and muted the already cautious tone in which the villagers spoke. Whether at dawn or dusk, the haze suspended everything in a half-formed state, the sort of atmosphere that made it difficult to determine where the forest ended and human habitation began. The villagers, hardened by distance from larger settlements and disciplined by custom more than law, carried themselves with a quiet rigidity, their shoulders drawn inward as though sheltering private fears. Even in their daily routines, repairing fences, tending to livestock, hauling split logs to their doorways, there was a tension that clung to them as faithfully as the damp air. It was within this setting, with its heavy silence and its suspicion toward anything that defied routine, that the earliest hints of a concealed birth circulated. Late-night lantern light seen through the cracks of shuttered windows, footsteps in the snow where no one admitted walking, and the low, hurried voices of those attempting to stifle a disturbance before it became a matter for communal scrutiny. The social order of the village was shaped less by official titles than by tradition. The elder hunters held the greatest authority, not only because they provided much of the community's sustenance, but because they claimed an intuitive understanding of the forest that surrounded the settlement like a living boundary. Their word carried weight in matters of danger, morality, and the interpretation of signs observed in nature. Beneath them stood the craftsmen and landholders, followed by laborers and young apprentices whose opinions were seldom solicited except in moments of crisis. The village's isolation intensified the moral pressure that rested on every inhabitant. Nothing remained private for long, and even minor deviations from accepted behavior were noted, remembered, and whispered about in the hours when the fog grew denser and the wind carried the scent of pine resin into the narrow lanes. It was in this context of hierarchy and implicit obedience that a rumor began to take shape, a rumor not of wrongdoing, but of the quiet upheaval that accompanies a secret brought into the world. Some women had noticed that a particular cottage produced no smoke for several days, though a lantern had been seen burning within. Others observed that the occupant had avoided the weekly gathering in the central square, a lapse that would normally invite gossip, but now elicited only uneasy glances. For reasons no single witness could articulate, the mere suggestion of a child born in secrecy unsettled the villagers more profoundly than any threat posed by the forest. They were accustomed to the dangers of the wilderness. Unpredictable weather, weak harvests, or roaming predators were all hardships that had been endured by generations before them. But the notion that someone, could emerge within the village without passing through the sanctioned rituals of acknowledgement and blessing disrupted the fragile balance between the community and the land it depended upon. A concealed birth implied a breach in the unspoken pact of mutual surveillance and shared responsibility. It suggested that fear or shame had driven someone to act outside the boundaries of tradition, and such a breach, though small and silent, cast long shadows in a settlement where the smallest deviation could be perceived as a warning. Compounding the unease were reports from the hunters returning from the mist-heavy woods. These men, weathered by years spent navigating the dense growth and steep hollows, spoke of markings in the soil that defied immediate explanation. They did not claim danger outright. Few in the village indulged in dramatic speculation, but they noted the impressions with the careful concern of those who rely upon interpretive skill for survival. The markings, they said, were too deliberate to belong to passing animals, yet too light to suggest a human walker bearing full weight. One hunter mentioned faint disturbances on the surface of a frozen creek, as though someone had tested the thickness of the ice with unusual precision. Such observations were recounted in low tones by the fireside, where the crackling of burning would offer a measure of comfort against the growing sense that something within their midst was shifting in ways they could not yet define. Meanwhile, a subtle act of defiance, so small it might have passed unnoticed in a more populous region, began to circulate in hushed accounts. A young villager, known for his inquisitive nature, was said to have lingered at the forest's edge past curfew, peering into the haze as though expecting someone to emerge. When questioned, he offered no explanation, only a slight tremor in his voice suggesting he had witnessed something he dared not describe. The elders responded with stern warnings about wandering thoughts and misplaced curiosity, yet their admonitions carried an undercurrent of apprehension. In a community accustomed to rigid conformity, even a single deviation, especially by someone young and impressionable, hinted at pressures building beneath the surface. The first true shift in atmosphere arrived not through an event, but through a collective sensation, the kind that individuals notice privately but hesitate to acknowledge aloud. Villagers began to avoid certain footpaths at dusk, claiming the fog along those routes seemed thicker than usual, or that the rustle of underbrush carried an unfamiliar rhythm. Mothers kept children inside a little longer each morning, citing the lingering cold, though the season had begun its slow transition toward milder days. A sense of anticipation, uneasy, waited, settled over the settlement, as though the community was waiting for something unspoken to reveal itself. No single individual admitted fear, yet the collective silence, the cautious glances exchanged in passing, suggested that the village felt its world narrowing in ways none could name. By the week's end, the rumor of unnatural tracks in the forest had become the dominant topic whispered behind closed doors. Rather than dismissing the reports as hunters' overinterpretation, the villagers began to assemble these details into a vague, unsettling pattern. A concealed birth, a cottage gone quiet, a youth's unexplained agitation, tracks that were neither fully human nor fully animal. The pieces did not form a clear narrative, but they created a tension that pressed upon the village like a hand on its throat. The fear was not of violence or external attack. It was the fear of something emerging from within, something that challenged the moral foundation on which their society rested. And so, in these first days of the unfolding account, the village found itself poised between certainty and dread. No one spoke openly of the possibility that a child, born in secrecy, existing just beyond the reach of communal oversight, might be moving through the forests with a strange, instinctive skill. Yet the thought lingered beneath every conversation, a silent intrusion shaping the villagers' gestures, their silences, and the ways they glanced toward the woods when they believed no one else was watching. It was in this atmosphere, oppressive and anticipatory, that the psychological terrain of the story took root, preparing the ground for the greater conflicts yet to come. As days turned into weeks, the child's cautious mastery of the village and forest became apparent through subtle acts. A basket of grain left outside a cabin appeared slightly disturbed. A small footprint was visible near the edge of the woods. A door creaked open only to find the attic empty. The hunters interpreted these signs as a growing menace. They did not realize they were tracking the child's first experiments in misdirection, learning where they looked, how they thought, and how they moved through the mist. Villagers, now aware of oddities, began whispering more urgently. Some feared the unseen presence might be dangerous. Others suspected the child, though they knew nothing of his existence, merely because of the pattern of disturbances. In private, the child observed these conversations from hidden vantage points, from the branches of a tree, from the shadows of an unused shed, learning which voices carried authority and which betrayed doubt. With each observation, he honed strategies for concealment, moving silently, leaving false signs, sometimes doubling back to confuse any pursuer. One young hunter, zealous and eager to prove himself, ventured too far, attempting to follow tracks that ended abruptly in soft soil. The child had placed them deliberately, using fallen branches and scattered leaves to mislead him. The hunter returned, exhausted and bewildered, claiming the tracks belonged to some unnatural creature. In reality, the child had only tested his own cunning, confirming that his observations of human behavior allowed him to predict their moves. By doing so, he was not merely hiding. He was learning to survive, to outthink, and to turn fear into protection. Even inside homes, the child exercised influence unseen. A neighbor leaving food on a window ledge would find it subtly shifted by morning. A pair of chickens wandered near the path he used, and their tracks intersected with his own to create confusion for anyone attempting to follow. Each act was small, calculated, and, above all, invisible in its intent. The child's existence remained a secret, yet his presence already began to shape the rhythm of the village, forcing adults and hunters alike to confront uncertainty and fear without knowing its source. By the end of these first weeks, the village teetered between suspicion and panic. Hunters debated extending their search. Villagers whispered accusations and half-truths. All the while, the child watched, learning, anticipating, and outmaneuvering them with nothing more than his small size, keen senses, and the lessons taught in his hidden infancy. The stage was set for the larger pursuit, but now it was clear. The child had already mastered the forest, and the forest had already taught him to master the hunters. In the days that followed the earliest whispers, the mood of the village shifted with a kind of incremental inevitability, as though the community were collectively moving toward a conclusion none of its members truly wished to reach. The hunters, whose authority rested on their claimed familiarity with the forest, began their daily ventures with a more deliberate caution. They advanced into the woods not with the straightforward confidence of men accustomed to reading wind scars on bark or recognizing the patterns of small game, but with a measured hesitancy that betrayed the growing suspicion that something, or someone, was observing them in return. It was not unusual for hunters to track signs of movement along the tree line, but now they found themselves examining the faintest disturbances in the underbrush, the lightest impressions upon thawing soil, and the peculiar arrangement of fallen twigs, as though these might provide clarification. Instead, each detail, ambiguous, slight, inconclusive, added only further ambiguity, intensifying the belief that the forest had begun concealing truths rather than offering them freely. The early signs of the town-wide pursuit emerged quietly, almost inadvertently, when one of the elder hunters returned from the woods pale and unusually reticent. He avoided the usual practice of sharing observations beside the communal fire, claiming fatigue, yet his silence spoke more loudly than any declaration. Later, his young apprentice recounted, in a trembling whisper, that the hunter had paused mid-step that morning, kneeling near a cluster of pine needles where the ground appeared disturbed by something small yet deliberate. The disturbance was neither human in stride nor animal in rhythm. Rather, it resembled a series of calculated placements, as though someone had moved with careful intent to avoid leaving a clear mark. That a child, if such a child indeed existed, might possess the instinct to navigate the woods so cautiously defied explanation, yet the apprentice insisted he felt watched during those moments of study. Whether the sensation was real or a product of the fear that had taken hold of the community, no one could say. These early accounts spread quickly despite efforts to contain them. The villagers, accustomed to exchanging information through discreet nods or quiet remarks during routine labor, found themselves speaking in tones so low they barely carried across the narrow lanes. Fear, ambition, and guilt mingled in these conversations, though none admitted to such motivations openly. Some saw in the growing unease an opportunity to align themselves more closely with the hunter's authority. Others felt a rising guilt, whether for concealing a private suspicion or failing to act when the first hints of a concealed birth were noticed. Still others feared that knowledge, any knowledge, might bring unwanted scrutiny upon them. The oppressive silence of the previous week transformed into a subdued, fragmented dialogue maintained behind locked doors and shuttered windows. In this climate, even the innocent behaviors of daily life acquired new meaning. A neighbor's failure to greet another, a door closed more forcefully than usual, a lantern extinguished earlier than expected. The first morally questionable decision occurred during one of the hunters' meetings, held in the old council shed near the village's central square. What was discussed behind those walls was not formally recorded, but multiple accounts later pieced together a version of events that circulated through the settlement with the slow certainty of approaching winter. One hunter, impatient with the ambiguity of the search, suggested extending their jurisdiction deeper into private matters, examining homes, questioning families, and verifying the presence of all children accounted for within the village registry. Though this proposal directly challenged the boundaries traditionally respected among the villagers, it was not met with immediate refusal. Instead, a hush settled over the group, in which each man silently considered whether maintaining order justified such an intrusion. Ultimately, the suggestion was not acted upon, yet the very fact that it had been voiced and not immediately condemned marked a shift in the moral landscape of the village. The authority of the hunters had begun to press against the private realms of family and home, and the villagers sensed this expansion even without knowing its exact details. Meanwhile, in the dim interior of one of the cottages where the windows were often shuttered, a villager made a choice that would later be remembered as the first significant act of quiet resistance. She had overheard fragments of conversation through her thin walls, fragments that implied the hunters were considering more intrusive methods of confirming the identity of the one they sought. The woman, known among neighbors for her attentiveness and calm manner, ventured under cover of darkness to a remote corner of the settlement where another family lived in relative isolation. She did not speak openly of what she suspected. Instead, she offered vague warnings, couched in careful phrasing, that suggested the coming days would bring unwelcome scrutiny. This gesture, though small, revealed the first crack in the village's outward unity. It indicated that some among them felt sympathy, perhaps even loyalty, toward the unseen child or the family tied to the child's existence. Yet this sympathy brought with it its own burden of guilt, for to aid anyone who defied communal norms was to risk sharing responsibility for whatever consequences followed. Throughout this period, subtle signs of the child's cunning began to emerge, not directly through sightings, but through the way certain attempts to track the unknown presence invariably failed. One hunter who prided himself on his ability to follow the faintest trail reported that a set of prints he had discovered ended abruptly near a shallow ravine, with no indication of continued movement. The ground was too soft to conceal tracks naturally, and the hunter later admitted in private that he had never encountered anything like it. Another searcher claimed he had seen the outline of a small figure moving between trees, only for the figure to vanish the moment he attempted to approach. These accounts were not accompanied by displays of bravado. Rather, they were offered with a subdued humility, as though acknowledging a presence in the forest capable of outthinking experienced men required unusual restraint. The tension in the village deepened as the boundaries between duty and conscience blurred. Some villagers began to question the wisdom of pursuing someone whose actions had not, as yet, harmed anyone. Others insisted that ignoring the matter would endanger the moral structure upon which the village was built. A few, privately burdened by knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the concealed birth, wrestled with whether offering help would condemn them or redeem them. The strain of these inner conflicts manifested in subtle ways. Slightly trembling hands as firewood was stacked, momentary pauses before answering a question, the faintest hesitation before entering the woods alone. What made the atmosphere increasingly oppressive was not any open conflict, but the quiet cruelty that began to take hold in interpersonal interactions. A villager who once enjoyed relative trust found himself subtly excluded from routine discussions. Another, known for occasional improprieties, became the subject of pointed glances and whispered speculation, even though his behavior remained unchanged. These shifts reflected not animosity toward specific individuals, but the community's need to redirect its anxiety onto visible, manageable targets. Pushing suspicion toward familiar figures provided temporary relief from the greater, unspoken fear that an unseen child might possess abilities or instincts the villagers could not comprehend. The pressure to conform, already strong, tightened further, creating an environment where silence became both defense and weapon. The suspense during this period arose not from overt action, but from small, layered moments of observation and secrecy. Villagers found themselves watching others more closely than before, tracking where people walked, how long they stayed indoors, whom they spoke to, and what they carried. The forest, once a familiar boundary, began to loom in the collective imagination as a shifting presence capable of hiding or revealing truths at will. Even the daily routines took on new weight. The way smoke curled from chimneys, the direction of footprints in the morning frost, the sudden absence of birdsong at dusk. These details, though mundane, felt charged with significance. By the end of this phase, the first decisions had been made that would quietly set the larger conflict in motion. Some villagers aligned themselves more firmly with the hunters, driven by fear or ambition. Others felt their loyalty tested by whispers of innocence associated with the child in question. A few attempted to distance themselves from the matter entirely, though the tightening social pressure made neutrality increasingly difficult. As these decisions accumulated, small, private choices rather than dramatic declarations, the moral certainty that once held the village together began to fracture. The pursuit had not yet begun in earnest, but its shape was becoming visible, like the silhouette of a figure emerging slowly from the fog. As the weeks progressed, the village entered a state of tension so constant and pervasive that even the smallest disturbance could ripple through the community with disproportionate force. The mist, which for generations had been treated as little more than a persistent feature of the surrounding woods, began to feel like a living intermediary, an opaque curtain that both separated the villagers from the child they sought and, paradoxically, seemed to protect the child by obscuring every trail. The hunters, who once moved through the forest with the quiet confidence of men who knew each rise and hollow by memory, now advanced with sharpened nerves and measured deliberation, aware that each misinterpreted sign or overlooked detail carried consequences not only for their quarry, but for their own reputations within the settlement. Their authority remained intact, yet doubt had begun to settle over them like the condensation on their weathered boots. The villagers, observing the hunters' unease, internalized it in their own way. Conversations grew shorter. Trust, once taken for granted among neighbors bound by generations of shared hardship, became brittle. Households began watching one another with a kind of wary attentiveness, as though any subtle change in routine, a late return from the well, a shutter closed too quickly, a child kept indoors without explanation, might offer insight into the truth concealed beneath layers of silence. In a society where privacy was minimal and communal oversight constant, even the faintest deviation felt significant. The villagers spoke little of the concealed birth, yet the subject hovered over every interaction like a silent accusation none dared to voice. During this period, the secretly born child, still unseen, still unnamed, seemed to assert a quiet agency through the patterns of absence and disruption left in the forest. Attempts by the hunters to form consistent search routes were undermined by the disappearance of markers they had placed only the day before. Branches they had cleared from narrow paths reappeared in new configurations, arranged with a deliberateness too subtle for natural explanation, yet too understated for anyone to claim confidently they had witnessed human intervention. One hunter, known among his peers for his stoic pragmatism, reported that he heard faint movement behind him only moments after he had paused to drink from a small leather flask. When he turned, no figure stood among the pines, yet the underbrush swayed with a rhythm that did not correspond to the wind. His account, though delivered with characteristic restraint, unsettled the other hunters, not because of any certainty it offered, but because of the ambiguity it preserved. Meanwhile, fractures among the villagers began to widen. Internal struggles, fear of authority, guilt over withheld knowledge, and the instinctive desire for self-preservation found their way into whispered arguments within homes that had long appeared united. Some families urged caution, convinced that the hunter's pursuit threatened to escalate beyond its intended scope. Others advocated cooperation, fearing that any sign of reluctance might draw suspicion toward them. A few individuals, having pieced together enough fragments to form a rough understanding of the child's origins, wrestled with whether revealing those truths would resolve the tension or deepen it. The oppressive atmosphere eroded the clarity of moral judgment, leaving the villagers uncertain whether their actions served justice, fear, or mere conformity. One turning point occurred when a hunter, known for his rigid adherence to tradition, made a choice that caused unease even among his own kin. Upon discovering disturbed soil near a grove bordering the marshes, he concluded that the child had passed through hours earlier. Unable to determine the direction of movement, he proposed setting an unauthorized perimeter, extending their search into areas typically avoided during the spring thaw due to unstable ground. Though his companions discouraged such an action, citing the dangers involved, he returned after nightfall covered in mud and visibly shaken, claiming he had followed subtle signs until they abruptly ceased at a point where the fog hung unusually thick. His decision to act alone, without communal approval, heightened the sense that the boundaries governing the hunter's actions had begun to dissolve. That evening, several households kept lamps burning longer than usual, as though reluctant to surrender themselves to the uncertainties that darkness now seemed to conceal. A second turning point emerged not through bold action, but through a quiet moment of courage. A villager, one who had previously offered a vague warning to a family living on the outskirts, found herself confronting the weight of her own conscience. Aware that the hunter's methods were becoming increasingly intrusive, she sought out a trusted elder who was known for his measured judgment. Without naming specific individuals, she implied that the child might not pose the threat others feared, and that the pursuit risked inflicting unnecessary harm on innocent parties. The elder listened with patient attention, yet the caution in his response suggested he understood the danger such opinions posed. While he did not betray her confidence, he urged her to exercise restraint, reminding her that the forest held more secrets than any single family could bear. This exchange, though conducted in low tones, contributed to the growing sense that dissent existed beneath the surface, an undercurrent strong enough to unsettle those responsible for maintaining order. As the hunters intensified their search, more signs of the child's clever evasion surfaced. Food stores left in certain huts near the tree line were found subtly disturbed, not plundered, but selectively altered, as though someone had taken only what was essential for immediate survival. Paths through patches of dense thicket appeared freshly parted, yet footprints were absent, suggesting a form of movement that defied simple tracking. One hunter, after several hours spent examining shallow depressions in the moss, suggested privately that the child must have been taught, by whom, he did not speculate, to navigate the forest with methods unfamiliar to the villagers. The notion that knowledge existed beyond the community's sanctioned experience unsettled him deeply. Under these mounting pressures, the veneer of moral certainty that had once given structure to village life began to crack. The hunters found themselves torn between duty and an emerging awareness that their pursuit was based as much on fear as on evidence. Villagers questioned whether their quiet compliance aligned with conscience or simply shielded them from scrutiny. The atmosphere of systemic pressure, subtle, pervasive, forced individuals into positions where inaction felt as consequential as action. The forest itself seemed to respond to the escalating tension. Birds that once signaled the arrival of dawn grew silent at irregular intervals. The usual chorus of insects at dusk softened until it became little more than a distant hum. The ever-present mist thickened on certain mornings to the point where the outlines of cottages blurred, giving the impression of structures dissolving into the whiteness. These environmental shifts, though natural in themselves, were interpreted by the villagers as signs of imbalance, omens reflecting the moral and social turmoil brewing within their community. By the end of this phase, it had become increasingly clear that control, once the unspoken foundation of life in the settlement, was slipping from the established authority. Each failed attempt to locate the child, each unexplained disturbance in the woods, each whispered conversation behind closed doors added weight to the growing sense that the situation was moving toward a confrontation the villagers were ill-prepared to navigate. The hunter's certainty waned, the villagers' trust fractured, and the child, unseen yet unmistakably present in the consequences of every decision made, became the silent axis around which the entire settlement now revolved. What remained was an atmosphere charged with apprehension, moral ambiguity, and the slow, inevitable momentum toward a reckoning that no one could yet articulate. The days ahead would draw these tensions into sharper focus, setting the stage for the confrontation that would define the village's legacy long after the mist cleared. The final hunt began not with a shout or a horn, but with a silence so complete it seemed as if the forest itself refused to breathe. Dawn had not yet broken. Only the faintest bluish pallor bled through the mist. The hunters moved in a tightening ring, each man guided more by fear than certainty. Word had spread. Someone had seen a silhouette slipping between the trees at dusk, small, fast, impossible to track by normal means. Some swore it was the child. Others insisted it was a trick of fog and exhaustion. But no one could afford to doubt anymore. The entire village, trembling beneath weeks of rumors and half-truths, demanded resolution. Along the narrow paths carved through the undergrowth, the air trembled with unspoken accusations. Every hunter knew, on some level, that they were not simply tracking a mysterious child. They were trying to catch the echo of their own choices. The concealed birth, the silence that followed, the rumors that festered, the decision to pursue rather than protect. By now, those decisions had hardened into something irreversible. Inside the village, the elders gathered in the council hut, their lantern casting long, fractured shadows across the wooden walls. Their faces were drawn and pale. It was here, behind the closed shutters, that the last fragments of truth spilled out. A midwife, her voice barely audible, finally confessed that she had helped hide the birth. A young hunter, one of the first to swear he'd seen unnatural tracks, whispered that he had exaggerated, not out of malice, but to gain favor with his superiors. A mother who had remained silent for fear of punishment admitted she had seen the child once, near the well, and that he had looked more frightened than wild. The truth did not bring relief. It brought dread. Back in the forest, the hunters reached the heart of the mist, a clearing where ancient trees twisted overhead, their branches interlocking like the ribs of a great wooden cage. The ground bore shallow impressions, but they were ambiguous. A smear of disturbed leaves, a broken twig, a faint mark in the soil. Nothing conclusive, yet too precisely placed to ignore. It was as if the forest itself were arranging clues, nudging the hunters forward, deeper into their own desperation. Tempers frayed. Two hunters argued about whether to split their group. One insisted the child was deliberately misleading them, manipulating their fear. Another muttered that perhaps the child didn't want to be found at all, and that maybe they should question why they were hunting him in the first place. That suggestion was met with cold stares. To doubt the hunt now was to challenge the entire foundation of the village's authority. At last, a figure flickered at the edge of the clearing, small, barely visible through the haze. The hunters froze. One of them raised a hand, signaling silence. Another reached for him, as if unsure whether to stop or encourage him. The air hung between them, heavy with the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. They approached slowly, their boots sinking softly into the damp earth. The figure stepped backward, not with panic, but with a kind of quiet calculation, as though judging the distance, the angles, the intentions of each man closing in. Even without a clear view, The hunters felt something unsettling. The child was not frantic or helpless. He seemed to understand them, their fear, their hierarchy, their need to reclaim control. And he moved as though he had already anticipated the direction of their next step. One hunter, trembling, demanded to know why the child had been born in secret, why the village had been deceived, why they had been sent into the woods to confront something they did not understand. His voice thinned with panic as he spoke, cracking through the clearing like a brittle twig. In response, the child offered no words, only a stare that made the hunters confront what they had long refused to admit. The village had not feared danger. It had feared the truth. Then, without warning, the mist shifted. A sudden wind swept through the clearing, carrying an icy scent of pine and soil. The hunters' torches guttered. Their formation broke. In the confusion, someone shouted, insisting the child had moved to the left. Another cried out that he had gone to the right. The clearing erupted into chaos, not violence, but a collapse of authority. Orders contradicting orders. Men stumbling into one another. The thin thread of discipline snapping. And the child, calm and precise, slipped into the deepest folds of the forest, leaving behind only the crushing realization that the hunters had cornered nothing but their own fear. By the time the mist thinned and the men regrouped, the child was gone. The village elders emerged hours later to find the hunters silent, standing in a dispersed circle around the empty clearing, each man haunted by what he had almost done, or what he had allowed to happen through his silence. Secrets had surfaced, but too late. The truth was now a knife without a handle. No one could pick it up without being cut. And somewhere in the forest, unseen and unhunted for the first time, the child walked onward, not triumphant, but free enough to choose a path not defined by the village's fear. In the days following the failed hunt, the forest surrounding the village returned to its usual rhythms long before the people did. Mist still gathered at dawn, drifting past the wooden fences and narrow footpaths, but now the villagers met that mist with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of tradition or caution, but one shaped by memory they wished to escape and yet could not deny. The echoes of the confrontation lingered in the air like a scent that refused to fade. The hunters returned first, stepping into the village square without triumph, without explanation, and without meeting one another's eyes. Their shoulders were hunched as if carrying invisible burdens. Some tried to resume their routines, tending traps or repairing tools, but their movements were mechanical, halting. Others barely left their homes. The youngest of them, who had once spoken boldly about bravery and duty, now avoided the woods entirely. He flinched even when he heard branches snapping in the breeze. It was as though the forest had taught them something about themselves that none of them were ready to acknowledge. The elders convened once more, though their meetings were shorter now, marked by hesitation rather than authority. The midwife who had revealed the truth about the concealed birth found herself both feared and sought after. Some villagers approached her quietly, asking what else she knew, what else had been hidden, what else might be waiting to surface. Others blamed her for the village's shame, whispering behind her back that the events had spiraled out of control because she had interfered. She bore their judgment with a weary calm, knowing that blame was simply another way for people to avoid confronting their own choices. Over time, the story of the child began to shift, retold differently depending on who spoke and what they wished to forget. To some, he became a threat that had vanished into the trees, proof that the village had been right to fear what was unknown. To others, he was a symbol of innocence mistreated by a community blinded by its own traditions. And to a quiet few, he was a reminder of what courage looked like, a lone figure standing before an entire system and refusing to be broken by it. The forest itself became a place of uneasy reverence. Hunters treaded more carefully, as if the trees now listened. Children were warned not to wander alone, not because something dangerous waited there, but because something remembered them. And during the evenings, when the mist thickened and the lanterns glowed with a faint amber light, villagers would pause mid-sentence, glancing toward the woods with expressions that blended fear, guilt, and longing. Rumors persisted of small footprints found near the old well, or glimpses of movement at the edge of the tree line. Whether these sightings were real or merely the projections of restless minds, no one could confirm. But the idea that the child might still be watching, alive, growing, learning, placed a quiet strain on the community. Some hoped he would return to ask for justice. Others feared the very same possibility. Weeks passed, and the village slowly reshaped its own narrative. The elders spoke less of the hunt and more of an unfortunate misunderstanding. Hunters told their children that panic had clouded their judgment. Neighbors exchanged theories, adjusting details to make themselves appear wiser, kinder, less complicit. The collective memory bent and twisted like branches in the wind, each retelling sanding down the sharper edges of guilt. But there were a few who refused to rewrite what had happened. A young woman who had seen the child near the well often walked to the forest's edge and left small offerings, berries, bread, a folded piece of cloth, not out of fear, but in quiet apology. An older hunter, haunted by the look in the child's eyes, abandoned his weapon altogether and took to repairing fishing nets instead, murmuring that some burdens were too heavy to carry into the woods again. Even the midwife, long after the whispers around her had faded, continued to speak the truth to anyone who dared ask for it. In time, the child became a story told to those who were brave enough to listen, not a bedtime tale or a warning of danger, but a question with no simple answer. A reminder that fear can disguise itself as duty, that silence can destroy as effectively as action, and that innocence, when cornered, often understands more about survival than those who seek to control it. And so the legend took root. People spoke of the one who outsmarted an entire town of hunters, but what lingered beneath that phrase was not triumph or defiance. It was the unsettling awareness that the village had confronted not a threat from the forest, but the consequences of its own choices. As the weeks stretched on, the villagers found themselves returning again and again to a single unspoken question, one they could not bury, no matter how many times they tried to reshape the story. When a community builds its identity on fear, what happens when that fear finally looks back?